This is an old debate. I believe it's at least 8 years old. And I'd like to take a look at it. I've watched it before. It was a while back. But I find it very interesting. One, for just the purpose of an analysis of communication styles. And two, I like Sam Harris. On the other hand, Cenk, an interesting fellow, kind of reminds me of a water buffalo fighting over getting to the watering hole. So I figure we take a look at it. It's an interesting topic nonetheless. It used to be much bigger. One of the books Sam Harris wrote, I believe it was The End of Faith. I read it some time ago, and it was quite controversial at the time. And this is one of the results of it. So let's take a look.
All right, welcome to TYT Interviews. We're going to have what I hope is one of the most interesting interviews we've ever done. It's with Sam Harris. He has a BA in philosophy from Stanford, a PhD in cognitive neuroscience from UCLA. You might be familiar with some of his books: The End of Faith, Religion, Terror, and Future of Reason, Letter to a Christian Nation, The Moral Landscape, Lying Free Will, and now his most recent book, Waking Up, A Guide to Spirituality Without Religion.
The Moral Landscape is an excellent book, and I highly recommend it. It's very interesting.
Now, Sam, welcome to the Young Turks.
Thank you, Cenk.
I really appreciate you coming in. It's going to be an interesting conversation, as I said, for a number of reasons. There are a lot of things that we agree on. I would say at least 90% of our views are probably similar, if not identical.
And yet they can fight for 2 hours over that 5%.
Well, some people might be surprised by that. And there's some that we disagree on. And actually, the more that I've read your stuff, the more I realized the degree of our differences. Right. So that'll be interesting to talk about. And we want to air out everything. You asked our audience, hey, send in questions. We have to be honest with you guys. You see all these papers in front of me. We stopped reading after 75 pages of questions. Right. Okay, so there was a lot of questions for you, Sam. So let's start with the easy stuff, the stuff that we agree on, okay? So obviously you've written a lot about religion. You're a well-known atheist, although you don't love that word for reasons that you've explained. And on the topic of religion, I think we totally agree.
There was such a great era in the past with Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens. It was such an excellent time for literature written on this topic of religion. No matter what side you may agree with, there were some excellent thoughts brought to the table. I miss it, and I really enjoyed it.
You're against religion. I'm against religion. I'm against all the religions. You're against all the religions?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, great.
But I think I know there are things we disagree about in that area, but yes, we are both atheists by any reasonable definition.
Right. And having read some of your new book, actually, there was refreshing agreement there as well. Okay, so I love that you're pointing out that spirituality and religion don't have to be connected. I've been tearing my hair out saying this for so long. Yeah. I don't have to subscribe to one of the religions to be a spiritual person, right? And just because somebody is spiritual, and I'm not that spiritual, but I think I'm open to it, and I have no problems with other people being spiritual. And just because somebody's open to spirituality doesn't mean that they believe in voodoo or subscribe to any particular religion. So I think you talk about that in an interesting way in the new book.
Right.
So now the parts that I think we disagree on is Islam and perception of Muslims. Okay, so broadly speaking. So let's start that conversation.
Can we actually start just with the context for this conversation? Because
Sure.
I'm very happy to be talking to you, and I think we will have a good conversation. But I'm not at all happy with how we arrived here together, and I think there's something to be said about that, because viewers coming naively to this video won't understand, the context for this conversation. I think, and it's not a surprise to you because we've communicated by email, but I think you've treated me really unfairly in the last few weeks, and I've come here to clean up this mess. And that the structure of that conversation is an unfortunate one, because I'm going to be saying a lot of things that are going to sound defensive, right? I'm taking, the slime of a few people who you've had on your show before me off of me, right? And that's an unfortunate just context for any conversation, because one, I'm going to have to say some critical things about these people. These are people I don't actually want to talk about, like Reza Aslan and this guy C.J. Worrellman, who you've had on your show. And it's also,
For those who don't know, Reza Aslan was the primary opposition to a lot of this social movement that was occurring in this era.
and we're not going to talk about some of the interesting things we could talk about, like the book on consciousness and meditation and spirituality I just wrote. I mean, I doubt we're going to get to that. So there's an opportunity cost here imposed by the fact that there's a huge mess to clean up, and people should understand that that's the context.
Right. So that is your perception of it, and hence we have our first disagreement. I don't agree with that. Okay. So I think that the things that they said, well, number one, people come on the show and say things that I don't agree with all the time. You will say things tonight that I don't agree with, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have that conversation. Number two, you have a perception of what they said that is not the same as mine, right? Okay. You view it as totally unfair, but that's why we're going to have this conversation, right? Because I think it is fair. So let's talk about it and see where we come out.
He does a pretty good job in the beginning, being respectful, but whenever you sit down with someone, after a while, especially in an interview, those guards start to come down and your ability to monitor your behavior gets more difficult. I'd say at 20 minutes, things start to get a little bit interesting.
A deeper point about a problem with journalism that I think should be exposed here. Right. It's not, because I think you and I have a different view about just how this game should be played. I'll give you an analogy. So the website Salon has maybe half a dozen or a dozen articles on me that are just pure slander. I mean, they misrepresent my views. One of these articles, one of the writers calls me a douchebag. I mean, this is not journalism. These are just hit pieces that are on the website Salon. Now, any naive reader of that website, they visit this website, it's one of the most trafficked websites on earth. They think, well, this is all journalistically sourced. There's an editorial policy that has made all of this kosher. But the truth is, much of what you read on Salon is just maniacs in their bedrooms typing. I mean, this is not the New York Times. Now,
Salon would ask me to have you take this video off because you said that about that.
No, let me tell.
You see what I'm saying?
No, it's not a valid analogy, but we'll get there. So,
okay.
So when I communicate, this stuff is built up over time, and so I communicate with the editor-in-chief of Salon, complaining about this. One article says I supported the Iraq War. I never supported the Iraq War. So factual inaccuracies and tonal things that are just crazy for journalists to be doing. And the editor-in-chief of Salon says, well, I'm so sorry you feel that way, but at Salon, we're open to all voices. This is all about conversation. This is a salon, after all. So perhaps you would like to write an article for us, defending yourself, showing how you're not a racist and a bigot.
And make them money with his name.
Islamophobe and a Zionist and everything else we've called you. Yeah. So, and I said, okay, so great. So first you steal part of my reputation by just putting all of this stuff out there. Now you want to steal some of my time by getting me to work for you for free, right? And then you want me to drive all my traffic to your site, all my readers, so they can read where I have said, I'm not a racist and I'm not a genocidal maniac. Now, does this?
It's smart.
Unfamiliar, because this is the situation I feel like I'm in with you. And again, I'm not begrudging the conversation, because I think you and I will have a good conversation. But what has happened on your show in previous weeks, you've had this guy Whirlman, who's now a well-established fraud and liar, and he's outed as a serial plagiarist.
First of all, let's just be clear, though. The plagiarism charges came out after he was on the show.
Yes, it's true. But it was obvious to me that this guy was lying about my views, and he's on your show unrebutted for whatever, an hour.
Sam, you're here to rebut him. So let me answer some of those charges.
So let me just ask you one more question, then you can answer.
Watch how Cenk's body language change as this goes on. It's very interesting.
What journalistic purpose is being served by having that hour of video online until the end of the world, where he calls me a genocidal maniac? He says I want to execute a nuclear first strike against the Muslim world. I want to kill people for thought crimes. What journalistic purpose is being served when that video stands on its own? They're not going to necessarily find this video in association with that. That's just going to be out there forever, and this guy has no credibility. So why keep the video up?
So, Sam, you think that everybody's being unfair to you. So whenever you guys have a disagreement, you view them as being defamatory and malicious, etc. Yeah. But Sam,
not
you say
in this case.
Now you say incredibly outrageous things, like we should consider a nuclear first strike, right? We should consider torture. We should consider bombing.
And if you read the book, which I'm sure that Cenk didn't, these are well thought out arguments. These are not like, we should nuke them, kill them all kind of thing. These are well thought out and reasonable.
things. So let's go one at a time, right? You say all these
get
things,
into the details,
right? And we are going to get into the details, right? And then you put caveats in there, right? Which is smart. You put caveats, but you say we should consider all these things. And then when people criticize that, you go, "How could you?" Well, but of course they're going to, Sam. Even if you're right, they're going to criticize. Do you see what I'm saying? You have to expect that.
Criticism is totally fair, and hard-hitting criticism is totally fair. I publish very hard-hitting criticism of other writers and other scientists and public figures. So I mean, the stuff.
And Sam, as an academic, would appreciate well thought out criticism. One of the primary things in academia is peer review. You take it and you improve upon the body of knowledge that either exists or that you have done.
About Francis Collins, head of the NIH, is incredibly hard-hitting. There's no way he likes what I've written about him. But I was careful not to misrepresent his views. And if anyone ever catches me misrepresenting the views of one of my targets, I will be the first to apologize. That is a completely illegitimate way to argue. And now I can show you, so we're going to get into the details, I can show you how I'm being misrepresented by people like Reza Aslan and C.J. Worlman. So, but when I argue against Reza in this conversation, I will be very careful not to misrepresent his views. I don't have to distort his views to show you what's wrong with them. And he has never honestly dealt with one of my views. So just to give you one example, in his interview with you, he said, I get all my views about religion from watching television. Right? This is a line sometimes he says from watching Fox News. This is what happens when you know nothing about religion and you just get all your views from Fox News, right? Now, anyone who has actually read The End of Faith, my first book, knows that that's just ridiculous. I mean, this is an ad hominem attack that is not actually engaging my argument. And he's never engaged my specific arguments. And we'll get into the details, but I want to press you, and this is an incredibly boring part of the conversation. I don't want to stay here long, but it just seems to me that you have a responsibility for stewarding journalism into its digital future. And what Salon is doing is the end of journalism.
The Young Turks have changed so much over time. So much.
As I can say, and that is where journalism is going to die, where you see absolutely no burden to represent people accurately.
But Sam, can't you see that Salon would then say that you're doing the same exact thing that you're charging them of? They would say, hey Sam, you're not seeing the entire body of our work. You didn't see it. You didn't see the nuances. You didn't see the other articles.
No, I see what's said about me.
So then you say that we're the end of journalism and we do defamation. We do all these different things that you've charged us. Well, that's not fair. And then they would come to me and you say, hey, Reza said things that are unfair about me. So
there's a difference between opinion and journalism.
Questionable video that you've put up because my guest said something.
I think that we should make a law about how many adjectives that can be used in a news article
about you. And then Salon would say, your guest, Sam Harris, said terrible things about us. You should take that video down. I'm not taking any of them down. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't correct from time to time, Sam. So, for example, in one of our videos when we were discussing what you said, I slipped up and I said that you said it was a vast majority of Muslims. When you never said that. You said vast numbers of Muslims in the context of a discussion. So we went back and put an annotation on that to clarify it, right? To say that's not what Sam said.
Let's get into the details because this is not going anywhere.
Right. So I'm saying that we are being as responsible as we possibly can in airing out people's views. Here, this is not a TV conversation. You're not going to get cut off. Your mic's not going to get off. We're going to go as long as you want, as long as we want, as long as people have an understanding of where we stand. We do the best that we can there, okay? And so just because you disagree with someone doesn't mean they're wrong. So now, back to the original point. So obviously, based on all your books, Christianity is wrong, Judaism is wrong, Islam is wrong, right? Okay, I agree, they're all wrong. Okay, now the question comes as to whether
that really isn't too true. He does hold an opposing position, but he does recognize some of the cultural positives that are brought to a community from religion.
And this is probably the most common question we got submitted here. Whether you mean just Islam or do you mean Muslims? Right. Now, so there are dozens of quotes here from you, not referring to just Islam, but to referring to Muslims. Okay. So if you want, I can go through them,
No, let's just have the conversation. So
okay.
I can clarify what
right.
I mean.
So you don't just mean Islam, obviously. You do mean Muslims, right?
So
I really don't like that he put this stack of paperwork on the table. It's kind of symbolic of a stack of evidence or something like that.
When I talk about Islam, I'm talking about a set of ideas and their logical and behavioral consequences. Now, these ideas wouldn't matter if nobody believed them, right? So in every case, I'm interested in the numbers of people who believe specific ideas to the extent they actually believe them. So there are people who sort of believe what they say they believe. There are people who don't believe it at all. There are people who don't read the books. There are people who would bet their lives on the truth of every word. There's a whole range of cognitive commitment to certain doctrines. So when I talk about Islam, I'm talking about a set of doctrines. I'm talking about the Quran and the Hadith and the example of the Prophet Muhammad as evidenced in the earliest biographies. And so this is a set of stories, principles, claims about the nature of reality. And there are 1.6 billion Muslims, and there are, in any given context, even in the context of a single jihadist or a single Islamist mind, there will be different levels of adherence to specific doctrines. So you could get, I'm sure you could get as devout a Muslim as you're going to find anywhere, and you say, you make a list of all of the beliefs, that the sum total beliefs in the canon, and there's some he's going to be sure of, and there's some he's going to be 50-50 on, right? So so to the degree that any proposition like adulterers should be stoned to death, or apostates should be killed, or women are less valuable than men, or you can get into paradise by dying in defense of the faith, martyrs get 72 virgins, whatever the specific belief is, I am concerned, one, to just criticize the doctrine where it seems like a dangerous doctrine if believed, and then two, I want to have an honest discussion about the prevalence of that belief in the Muslim world. And by Muslim world, I mean the 1.6 billion Muslims wherever they happen to be, right? So the Muslim community here in Los Angeles, the Muslim community throughout Indonesia. So the Muslim world is just the sum total of Muslims. And if there's a person over there who was Muslim 15 minutes ago, but he no longer is Muslim by the end of the night after hearing our conversation, well then the Muslim world used to be over there, and now it's not over there. So I'm interested in what people believe and how much they believe it, and the link between belief and action.
Right. So if you're talking about the doctrine of Islam, I think that you're not really
See how quickly he is to retort?
going to get substantive disagreement
It's very aggressive.
from non-believers. Whether it's me, it's Glenn Greenwald, whoever it might be, right?
Well, it's not true. I mean, so we should go into the areas of disagreement because, one, non-believers, for the most part, certainly secular liberals who have never really been especially religious, and don't really know what it's like to believe in God or paradise or any of these things, they believe that all religions are more or less the same. So to single out any religion over any other in any context is already taboo among these people, and it's a sign of some kind of animus towards specific people. And you feel this. I mean, I've seen what you said about my remarks about Mormonism and my remarks about Islam. Reza Aslan certainly feels this. He thinks all religions are equally empty. They're equally just a tissue of stories and myths and images, and nothing's inherently violent in one as opposed to inherently peaceful in another. And we should
agree and disagree about that, because that's not exactly what I've said.
I'm talking about. Well, that was the last thing was Reza's view.
I know, but when you said that I see no difference between the religions, that's not true. So I think you make a good point about, for example, Islam or Christianity on one side and Jain's on the other side, right? So they are definitely different religions that teach different principles, and I believe that you can make value judgments about those, right? And say, hey, in Jainism, you're talking a more peaceful language, right? And so it is going to direct people in a different direction. That doesn't mean that no Jain can do anything violent or even do a holy war or do a suicide bombing. They can, but I understand that the ideology does not point in that direction.
Yes, and it points in the opposite direction. It would be unthinkable to really justify jihad or suicide bombing by recourse to the doctrine of Jainism. It's just because the central message of Jainism is nonviolence. You have to be a vegetarian. You could not open a slaughterhouse and say, well, this is a Jain slaughterhouse.
Right.
And so that matters.
Now, I think so. You can make distinctions. So we agree there. Okay. Now, the slight caveat to that, or a very important caveat to that, is that Jainism is fairly unique. Most of the other religions are bathed in blood. And so
to varying degrees, which is important.
Right. So that's point one. Point two, the point that you were alluding to, what I said about Mormons is, there we might have disagreement. So you say Mormons are slightly more absurd than Christians, right? Because you say you take all the absurdity of Christianity and then you add on top of it further absurdity that Jesus...
In Sam's book, what he argues in comparison to other religions is discussing things on a spectrum.
Come to Missouri, etc. Right. I think those are really good points, but to me, that's the difference between 2 + 2 = 5 or 2 + 2 = 6. Neither one is true, so what difference does it make? Well,
no, this is actually, it was a cute...
It's a very big difference. Nuance matters. And beliefs and actions, as Sam Harris said earlier, are huge based on your beliefs. They determine it.
Statement, and I think nothing hinges on it, but it's actually a mathematically precise statement. If you think Jesus is going to come back, that's one order of improbability. If you think Jesus is going to come back to Jackson County, Missouri, that actually increases the unlikelihood or decreases the likelihood.
I mean, if we're
That's
talking
just
about
straight
math, Sam, it's
mathematics.
like dividing by zero.
No,
It's
is not
equally unlikely that he's going to go to Jerusalem or Missouri. He ain't coming.
No.
The whole thing's is Zeus more likely to come to Missouri or to Athens?
It's the specifics that make it less probable. If you just think he's going to come back somewhere, that's one thing. If you think he's going to come back to Jackson County, Missouri, that's less likely. And that is a mathematically true point. It's just probability theory.
Even if I were to grant you that, which I definitely do not grant you, but even if I were to grant you that,
you're going to hear from a bunch of mathematicians who are going to insist that you grant that.
Okay, that's fine, and I look forward to that.
It's such a simplistic mindset.
Hopefully we'll get 75 pages on that. Sam, what difference does it make? They're both of them
in regards to Cenk.
Totally untrue. Totally untrue. Nobody talked to the Smith. Nobody talked to Jesus of Nazareth. It's made up.
I only made that point in the context of saying that you can say objectively true things about differences among religions, and even say objectively true things about the likelihood that any one is true. Now, there's another thing that cuts against Mormonism, which many people have noticed, which is we just know too much about Joseph Smith to take him entirely seriously. We know he was a con man and a libidinous guy who just kept making up new revelations so that he could get it on with the wives of his followers. I mean, there's just too much information on him. Now, the history of Islam and Judaism and Christianity is cloaked in much less certainty than that. So it's easy to romanticize who these guys were.
I think this is a small point, Sam, but let me just say on that, I look at it the exact opposite. Okay, so I know Joseph Smith was a charlatan. My favorite story is when he tells his wife, "Oh, God talked to me, and it turns out I need to have sex with our maid." Right. And she's like, "Oh, sure you do, buddy." And she's the first person not to believe in Mormonism in that instance. And Muhammad has very similar stories in Islam. Okay, very conveniently, he also had to have sex with all the women and conquer all the land, etc. Right? But Moses didn't even exist. Well, I would view that as less credible because he didn't even exist.
Yeah, but obviously many people think he did exist. It's just the more you push it into the well of history, it becomes you can just have your beliefs about the matriarchs and patriarchs be unconstrained by counter evidence.
So you're ironically giving them credit because they're so wrong we can't disprove them. It's such a black box.
Yes, it's a black box.
Okay, so that's why I say it's a small point of difference.
This is not important.
Right. So now, but either way, Islam is totally wrong. The doctrine is wrong, etc. Now, the question of whether it applies to all Muslims is where we get into the disagreement. And you don't say all Muslims. You're very clear about that, right? And I can give you quotes on that as well, so the audience is clear. Sam never says all 1.6 billion Muslims, and you don't even say majority. Okay.
Well, but the irony here is that I've heard some of the things you've said. So let me just pull this in here.
The difference between Cenk's body language and Sam's is so extreme. Look at how relaxed Sam is and sitting back in his chair. Cenk always moving forward when he speaks.
I seem to be painting, and many people have said this since the Bill Maher interview, I seem to be painting all Muslims with a broad brush. Even though I don't say all Muslims, in talking about Islam, I'm basically disparaging all Muslims. And I'm generalizing unfairly based on poll results to the rest of the Muslim world. But the whole point of thinking about poll results is to generalize specifically to those percentages that answered the question one way or the other. So if you want to...
those who adopt the belief.
If you run a poll and you find out that 30% of Muslims want 30% of Muslims in Indonesia want adulterers stoned to death, say, then when you're criticizing that belief, you're talking about 30% of Muslims in Indonesia. You're not talking about the other 70%, and that's the whole reason why one would refer to poll results. And that's what I do. I'm consciously aware of, and often saying, on this topic we're talking about this percentage, and on this topic we're talking about this percentage, and this is how else do you speak with precision about who you're talking about?
Well, I have a theory on how we can do that, and I'll get to that in a second. But I want to read some of your quotes now. Again, there are many, many like this, but to give people a sense of what I'm referring to, okay? So you say at one point, it is time we recognize and oblige the Muslim world to recognize that Muslim extremism is not extreme among Muslims. The truth about Islam is as politically incorrect as it is terrifying. Islam is all fringe and no center. Give you just one last one here. Unfortunately, in the case of Islam, the bad acts of the worst individuals, the jihadists, the murderers of apostates, and the men who treat their wives and daughters like chattel, are the best examples of the doctrine and practice. So that's among many.
You can't take a sentence or two out of his book and make a claim about it. It's such a simplistic way. I mean, there is an entire chapter. I'm sure those are at the conclusion. I can't recall. It's been a while since I read the book, but these are very well thought out. arguments with evidence.
Quotes along those lines. Right. Sam, when people read those, can you not see that they, at a minimum, view those statements as giving people permission to generalize about Muslims? That you're not just saying Islam, you're not just saying fundamentalists, which is a point we often make. Right. You're saying they are the center of Islam. So when you say that, it seems like you're generalizing about Muslims.
Well, let's unpack this a little bit. So on many of these points, you are talking about a majority of Muslims believing X. So you're talking about 75%. You're talking about, so if it's a belief that the Quran is the perfect word of the creator of the universe, that is incredibly well subscribed. Every poll I've ever seen on that puts that at 90%. Just wherever.
It would be the same.
It wouldn't be the same. It wouldn't be the same. We can talk about those polls, but it's not in fact the same. It's half of that, right? Mm-hmm. But when you look at, but again, there is variance on specific questions, and I will grant you there is a difference between what people will say they believe and what they really believe when push comes to shove and they have to behave in certain ways. So there are people who will say, yes, I think apostates should be killed, and then there's presumably fewer people who would actually kill an apostate or celebrate the killing of an apostate. So there's a delta between professed belief and actual belief. But my point here is that we use this word Muslim extremism as a kind of euphemism. Extremism, it's a misstatement because extremism suggests that there's only a tiny percentage of people who would subscribe to these views. And that on virtually no question do you ever get a tiny percentage. So it can be the most extreme question. Do you want thieves to have their hands and feet cut off? Do you want people killed for adultery? Whatever the question is, you're never getting 3% or 5%. With the possible exception of some of the former Soviet states that have a Muslim population, you are not getting, when you ask these questions in Egypt and Sudan and Nigeria, and you can't even ask them in Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia, if you could, Iran, Iraq, when you ask these questions, you're getting even Turkey, right? Turkey, the poster boy for the success of secular Islam.
It's such a beautiful country, by the way.
Get percentages that are 30%, 40%, 60%. And yes, well, you'd have to look at the Pew results.
Okay, so let's look at the Pew results real quick, okay? So now you brought up things that are important. That's why we have to actually go to some of the specific numbers there. And the reason why we do is because, and I want people to understand this. So when you say like 90% of Muslims subscribe to Quran being the word of God, etc. Right. And then you talk about it in the same sentence as cutting people's heads off, it leaves an impression like, oh, all Muslims believe that. But so let's be more precise.
I want to address the other quote you just raised, though, because it's important here. You said that when I said some of the most extreme people, the people who are cutting people's heads off, are the best examples of the faith. It was something like that, right? Mm-hmm. Now, which is to say, this is a group like ISIS or Al Qaeda is living in such a way that it is a kind of paint by numbers approach to the Quran and the Hadith and the example of the Prophet. It's not. This is a very straightforward, very plausible, very literal implementation of what is recommended there. You smite the necks of the infidels wherever you find them. You can take sex slaves. I mean, this is all stuff that Muhammad did. This is all stuff this is not stuff that the Buddha did. It's stuff that Muhammad did, right? So this is my claim. If we found a totally isolated people on a desert island and we gave them the canon of Islam, the Quran, the Hadith, the biography of Muhammad, and said, here, this is all you need to know, okay? Live by these principles. And then we came back in 1,000 years, and they were living like ISIS. There would be not much basis for surprise. Now, if we gave them the polycanon, the canon of the teachings of the Buddha, and came back in 1,000 years, and they were living like ISIS, there'd be reason to be flabbergasted. There'd be no obvious connection
now
between.
You brought up like 8 things I got to respond to. But let me. But now the island. I'm going to get back to the numbers.
Let me just say that is what I meant by saying that this is the best example of the actual doctrines in practice, because it is taking all of this very seriously and literally. It's, yes, women are worth less than men. Yes, that is a literal. Yes, you can take sex slave. That is.
So
you have to ignore that.
I think one of the points that he makes that contributes to these adoptions of beliefs is, I'm sure that we've all heard, you should set an example. These primary characters that are in these books, whether it be Jesus, Buddha, they set an example for behavior and what is or is not appropriate, and people follow suit.
So I've got to address that. So listen, Sam, when you say that's the literal words in the Quran, that's why I left Islam, because I read that and thought that makes no sense at all, right? Well done. So, okay, Now, when you say, if you compare it to Buddhism, although Buddhists can be extremely violent and do bombings and beheadings, etc., but that island, they might or might not, it depends on your interpretation of human nature. Are we all just driven to do that no matter what the text says? But put that aside.
It's a totally different point.
Okay, put that aside.
Yeah.
But if you left them on the island with the Old Testament or the Bible overall, they would be just as violent as Muslims if you left them with the Quran.
Let's deal with that claim.
So, okay, it's very important, and I got to go back to the numbers, and I got to go back to a lot of things, but it's very important that we understand your thoughts on that.
Yes. Okay.
Do you think that... go ahead.
Let's deal with that claim, then we'll get back to the numbers.
Okay.
So the claim is that the scriptures of Judaism and Christianity are just as violent as the scriptures of Islam, and therefore just as much of a liability. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And there are a few reasons why that's not true. Now, it is true to say that the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, is the ugliest, most theocratic, most barbaric of all these texts. Right? So it's worse than the Quran, in my view.
That's
right. However, there are differences that explain why Jews are not living like as prescribed in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and why they may never have really quite lived that way. First of all, some of the recommendations are clearly contextual and specific to what Saul was supposed to do to the Amalekites, and they're not generalizable to the future of humanity in quite the same way that.
Sam, that seems like an incredible excuse for it.
No.
It says
I'm not excusing.
Kill all of them who do not believe in the God of Israel. Kill them all.
Let me finish. I'm not excusing. I've already conceded that it's the most barbaric book, right?
Okay.
I'm trying to explain why it is Jews find it so easy to rationalize not living by the lights of this text. Actually, let me give you. Let me just talk. This is very important. So we got to dig deeper. It's the most barbaric book. One crucial difference, apart from differences of the sort that I just mentioned, the crucial difference is there's no clear notion of paradise and hell. There's no promise of martyrdom. There's nothing. You're not going to get the 72 virgins if you're a Jew. There's not this.
No, but there is punishment. When Saul does not kill all of them, then God strikes him down.
You can't. But there's no basis for this ecstatic death cult where you want to get to the other lives.
Saul was told by God that he should commit genocide on the Amalekites.
Yes.
And when he did not, God punished him. So it is you have to make sure that you commit the genocide.
But it is much more about living.
The big difference between the Quran and the Bible is there was the New Testament written. There was a new book with a new set of beliefs to be applied.
This world and waiting for the Messiah. If you are an Orthodox Jew, it is not about conquering the world for Judaism, right? It's not a missionary faith. Mm-hmm. You're not winning believers. You're not conquering by the sword. It's not convert or die, right? It is, we're waiting around for the Messiah to put things right. And again, I'm not discounting all of the harms of Orthodox Judaism. If you get me on the topic of Orthodox Judaism or conservative Judaism or the behavior of the Israeli settlers, I can be as vituperative as you'd ever want me to be. But there are differences that explain the difference we see between jihadists and Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn who are doing horrible things to women, and it's a very retrograde world they're creating, but they're not creating the same kind of chaos in this world. And I'll give
you're saying the principal difference is they don't care to convert you, okay?
No, and also this notion of paradise and martyrdom is the huge variable among jihadists.
Yeah.
It's the willingness, it's the eagerness to die, to get, and to not only get into paradise yourself, but to get everyone you care about in after you, to get past that velvet rope in the sky. That is at the center of this death cult behavior.
So even if I were to grant you that, then we go to the issue of Christianity, which has all of the barbaric stuff that's in the Old Testament, right? And then, of course, conveniently, Christians will cherry pick and say, well, we don't agree with that part of the Old Testament, but we love Genesis, right? So it has all that barbaric stuff. It's in the Bible. And then in the latter verses, it says, oh, by the way, God is going to come back and kill you all, okay? First, you have the messianic situation. If you have the worst of all worlds, you have to convert everybody, okay? And if you don't convert everybody, God will kill you all, right? So, and you should look forward to that because your beloved Lord is going to come and vacuum you into the sky. Yeah. So if anyone is the most dangerous, doesn't it make sense that it is the people looking forward to Armageddon where we all die? Well, by the way, actively try to make that happen.
Okay, well, let's deal with that. There are certain circumstances in which Christian belief is worse than Muslim belief, or Islamic belief. And I talk honestly about those circumstances. One example, which is may seem far afield here, but it's very consequential, is just you look at the religious impediments to embryonic stem cell research, and the fact that we didn't just pull off the brakes there and do this research full speed ahead. The impediments were Jewish and Christian beliefs about the souls entering zygotes at the moment of conception, and that you could have a petri dish with 3-day-old human embryos, which is just filled with souls that are every bit as important as the souls of our children or people with Parkinson's disease, and we have to worry about how we treat these microscopic specks in petri dishes. Crazy idea. It doesn't make any sense. This is something I've talked about. I would never dream of criticizing Muslims or Islam for their role in this, because according to Islam, the soul doesn't enter the embryo until day 80 or day 120, depending on which hadith you believe. And so Islam is totally off the hook there. Embryonic stem cell research is compatible with Islam. Okay. So again, the crucial point here is to recognize that specific beliefs have specific consequences insofar as they're really believed, and that's all I'm ever talking about.
Sam, when we talk about the difference between Islam and Christianity,
let's talk about it.
Okay,
so there are circumstances where it's worse.
You frame
the compatibility claim is an excellent one. Just seeing what beliefs are applicable in the actions that we take, especially in science. Lawrence Krauss once made an excellent point in a debate, I believe it was against Hamza Zortsky, where he made the observation in a comparison between how many Nobel Prizes have been given to those in the Muslim regions and the Western regions. It was very few. That is, to the Muslim regions.
In so much of your writing, you frame Islam as it appears irredeemable, whereas Christianity is just as violent and perhaps more dangerous because they look forward to and want to execute Armageddon, right? And have tried in the past and are also currently trying.
You're being too loose with Christianity. Christianity is not just as violent. Christianity has a history of extraordinary violence, right?
By far, historically, the most violent religion on the planet.
Well, that I don't know what you're lumping into the Christian bin there, but that's debatable. But let's just talk about the centuries of...
Muslims didn't start the 2 world wars. Muslims didn't do the Holocaust. Muslims didn't do the Inquisition. They didn't do the Crusades.
Because of Christianity. The world wars were not because of Christianity.
I know, that's complicated. When Christians do it, it's complicated. When Muslims do it, it's not complicated. It's because of Islam.
No. Okay, so this is another thing that we have to deal with. I am never blaming all Muslims for all the bad... I'm never blaming Islam for all the bad things Muslims have done in history. I'm only blaming Islam for the things Muslims have clearly done on the basis of the doctrine of Islam. Okay. And so too with Christians, and so too with Jews and Buddhists and everyone else. And you have to be precise here. So for instance, you mentioned the Buddhists who are cutting people's heads off, right? You must be talking about the Buddhists in Myanmar. This. Now, there is no connection between what they are doing and the doctrines of Theravada Buddhism. There is just none. So what they're doing is horrible. What they're doing is an instance of tribal violence. It is, and the connection to religion is there because the differences between Buddhists and Muslims is defined in terms of religion, right? It's not. I mean, there's probably an ethnic difference there too. There certainly is, but this is tribalism. It's xenophobia. It's hatred of the other. But it is not cashed out by the doctrine. It's not being inspired by the doctrine of Buddhism. It just isn't.
So then you're saying when Buddhists do it. I'm not. Wait, hold on. Hold on. When certain Buddhists do it, I'm not going to blame all Buddhists because it is not connected to their doctrine. But when Muslims do it, it's not complicated. It is because of their doctrine, and hence we can talk generally and loosely about Muslims.
No, I am not.
It's so interesting how Cenk is accusing Sam of painting with this wide brush over a population, when if you listen closely to Sam, he is always trying to keep Cenk on a specific topic, given that his claims are so specific. His arguments are very nuanced.
Talking generally and loosely about Muslims, and if you catch me doing it, then we just have to go into the details. So I'm only there are Muslims who do horrible things, and it has nothing to do with Islam, right? They're just people. People do horrible. If a Muslim robs a liquor store, it's got very little to do with Islam, right?
Very true.
You know, and especially if he just grabs a package of bacon on his way out as well. I mean, it's not Islam.
Another reason I left Islam. Okay. Bacon is God's food.
Yeah. So all I'm asking for. And I will concede that because I've gotten so much opposition on this point that occasionally I'm pretty strident in how I answer this, all I'm asking for is honest conversation about the logical connection between ideas and behavior.
So then let's go back to the idea of Christians versus Muslims, because I hope we're in the midst of that honest conversation. Yeah. So Christians, and I'm not saying you do it, and I'm curious what your take on this is, but I hear all the time from defenders of Christianity and from other atheists, but who happen to be born Christian, because we all get wedded to our identities and secretly want to defend it no matter how much we're atheists or agnostics. Mm-hmm. So they say, well, Hitler doesn't count because he wasn't really Christian, right? Except not only do we have the famous story of Gott mit uns on all the Bible on their belts that says God is with us. But Hitler literally said, I am doing the Lord's work, and that is why I am getting rid of the Jews. Right. So why, but that doesn't count. Okay, well, no, so then I would ask you this, because you actually specifically talk about when Muslims say that they're doing it for Allah, why don't we believe them? We should take them at their word. So shouldn't we take Hitler at his word that he is doing the Lord's work on behalf of Christianity?
Well, actually, Hitler is often unfairly described as an atheist. So the Christian opponents chalk all that up to atheism, Hitler's atheism, because they don't really consider him a Christian. Now, Hitler spoke about Jesus in his speeches. Whether or not he was motivated by Christianity, I think is debatable. But what is not debatable is that the anti-Semitism, which he got into drank with his mother's milk, and which was more or less universally subscribed in Germany for decades before the final solution, that is absolutely the product of 2,000 years of Christian fulminating against the Jews, despite the fact that Jesus was Jewish and all the apostles were Jewish.
Unbelievable.
So, but
your Lord was a Jew.
The hatred of Jews, right, is the product of Christianity, and the genocide of Jews in Europe was absolutely the product of Christianity. And I've written about this. I've spoken about this. It's a horrible fact. And now, again, that doesn't entitle us to be less than precise about the differences between Christianity and Islam. And I will grant you that there are circumstances in which, given the right conditions, all of a sudden I'd be more worried about Christian dogma than Muslim dogma or Islamic dogma. And yes, and those, a fascination with the book of Revelation and the end times and the rapture and hoping to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque so as to bring this about. All of this is terrifying. And the fact that there are Christians who are hoping for the end of the world is again, many secular liberals doubt that this is true, right? But the real burden here, and this is what I run into with the Glenn Greenwalds and the Reza Aslans, is that people don't actually believe that others believe this stuff. They don't actually believe that people believe in paradise or in heaven or in the rapture.
So we half agree and half disagree there, Sam, because I totally agree with you that some people absolutely believe, and it drives me crazy, as it does with you, that when people say, oh, nobody really believes that. That's not true. 32% of this country, the United States, is fundamentalist Christian, okay? Now,
there is a part of me that has always wanted to have I don't know if I just lack the ability, but to have that belief as others do. I don't know what it is, why I don't, or why others don't, but I imagine that belief, if you do truly believe it, would be very comforting.
Argue about definitions, but they're evangelicals. They say that the Bible is the inerrant word of God, right? Which they can't possibly believe because then they'd murder everybody, right?
Well, no, they have again, this is one difference with Christianity, and these are important differences. One difference is you have this notion that Jesus, his grace supersedes all of that Old Testament law, so that you can have, as a devout Christian who thinks that it's all perfect, you can find a rationale to ignore the Old Testament barbarism because Jesus has delivered his doctrine of grace, right? And then you get the Sermon on the Mount, and you take Jesus and half his moods, and you get very benign, very pacifistic attitudes. Now, Jesus, when he comes back on the Day of Judgment, is going to be wielding a sword and throwing sinners into a lake of fire, and all of that's weird. But in the meantime, you can find, as a Bible-thumping ignoramus who's against science and who's against evolution, and who doesn't think evolution is a hoax, etc., you can still find a basis to just wait around for the rapture. And you do not find a basis for holy war and a desire for martyrdom and all the stuff we're seeing in the Muslim world. You just don't.
You even said in some of your writings, and again, there's a pile of papers here, and I wish I could find the exact quote for you, but I think you'll remember it. But there's, of course, in the Bible, there's the famous line of "Give unto Caesar what is his, and God what is his." Right?
A very important line.
Right, very important line. That's part of what you're alluding to. But in the Quran, there's also a line that you've written about that says, don't enforce your religion on others. Right?
It's a huge line, and it's a great example that of what Sam Harris is proposing, because that line, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, it allows for certain things to be socially acceptable. For example, to pay taxes. Capitalism.
Compulsion in religion.
No compulsion in religion, right? Which, by the way, a great majority of Muslims agree with in the world, right?
Yes.
So, and in Islam, there are great parts too. Don't get me wrong. So there is the idea that all the races are equal, and that was not necessarily the case at the time that the Quran was written. That certainly people didn't think about it that way, and that's why there's so many Indonesian Muslims and German Muslims and Muslims of all different races, right? So there are good parts that you can cherry pick in any religion, and bad parts that you can cherry pick in any religion. So that's why I'm not getting why you I think, seem to think that Islam is irredeemable, whereas Christianity is redeemable.
Well, let me say I hope it's not irredeemable. We have a lot riding on the prospect of redeeming it. So I'm under no illusions that we're going to convince 1.6 billion Muslims to be atheists. So it has to be redeemable. So and I'm in dialogue with someone who I consider to be a genuine Muslim reformer now, Majid Nawaz, about just what is the way forward for the reformation of that all of us are waiting for in the Muslim world. So that's not my view that it's irredeemable, or at least that's a very bleak picture. But again, we have to be honest about the difference between Christianity and
beliefs change in time. As society changes, as our culture changes.
Islam here.
But I'm not seeing it. I mean, we just had a whole conversation about it.
We're not done. We're not done. So
okay.
One very important piece here is the example of Muhammad and the example of Jesus. Muhammad was not a hippie who got crucified, right? Muhammad was a conquering warlord. Muhammad's ethics, his life course, has much more in common with Alexander the Great or Genghis Khan than it does with Jesus or with Buddha or with Mahavira or other progenitors of the world's, quote, great faiths.
Yeah, but Jesus wanted to conquer the world. He just sucked at it.
No, well, that's one way to say it. But he was not ordering people's heads cut off. He got crucified.
Power to.
Well, no, you're reading that into the situation. But I'm saying
I don't know why he can't make a recognition of his claim concede a bit in order to move forward in the conversation or make progress in a constructive manner.
You get out of Jesus. The Sermon on the Mount doesn't give you, okay, let's cut the heads off of those 300 Jews and let's take sex slaves.
That's
right?
If you want to cherry pick the good parts of the Bible, there are plenty.
Yeah, but
there are plenty.
But the bad parts are not as extensive. It's much easier to cherry pick the good parts.
No, we just talked about how the bad parts are extensive, if not worse.
Well, let me just tell you the difference here. First of all, the Bible is a vast and vastly self-contradictory book, right?
Yeah.
So the cherry picking is made so much easier by the fact that there's no way to reckon. There's no truly central message. And especially if you're taking the Old Testament and the New Testament, and you can forget about half of it very easily. It would take you a month and a half to read the whole thing from cover to cover. The Quran is a much shorter, much more streamlined book, and it has a central message, which is very much in harmony with the example of Muhammad. It is not the central message of the Quran, arguably, certainly a central message, is you should spread this one true faith to the ends of the earth, and you spread this by conquest, not conversation. It is convert or die, or if you happen to be a person of the book, you can live as a dhimmi. Now
So Sam, that's a very important distinction though, because the Quran says don't touch the Christians and the Jews, they're people of the book. And of course, it's also wildly contradictory in different parts. And there's a very legitimate case to be made that when they talk.
But there's a huge catch to that.
Infidels, they're talking about the pagans of the time. Okay. And so.
But that's cold comfort to 1.2 billion Hindus who are polytheists and just completely beyond the pale by the light of this doctrine, right? Mm-hmm. So. But I want to deal with your point.
Christians want to convert them too, and if they don't convert them, it doesn't matter because they're all going to get blasted by God at the end.
Okay, but that to be a fiction, and that's very different than waging war in this life against these people. Okay, the Yazidis are not being killed by the Iraqi Christians, right? And there's a reason for that.
But then when you get into the real world, Sam, instead of the hypothetical world of the doctrines, right? Again, in the real world, there's two things that are very important that happen. One, historically, Christians have cherry-picked the good parts at times, Martin Luther King Jr., Mother Teresa, etc., and they have picked hideous parts of the Bible for slavery, the Inquisition, the Holocaust, the anti-Semitism, and the list goes on and on and on. So historically, I mean, on Holocaust alone, let alone everything else I've mentioned here, Christians win. They have been the most violent.
Okay, but again, you have to be more careful here because the Holocaust was not a straightforward and honest implementation of Christian doctrine. You can't look into the Bible and get a good Christian justification for the Holocaust. What you get with it?
Of course you
can. No, you can't.
Of course, it says kill them all that don't believe.
Not for Christianity. No, it doesn't. It simply doesn't.
First of all, it's in the Old Testament, which is in the Bible. It's people pretend it's not in the Bible. If it wasn't in the Bible, we just have the New Testament.
Jesus and the central message of his teaching does not get you the Holocaust. There's not a straight line there. There is a straight line.
It's like a total excuse to be honest.
It's not an excuse. But then look at the differences in the real world. Why aren't? I mean, this is practically a science experiment, right? You've got Christians in many of these Muslim communities that are being mistreated by the West, or being mistreated by the Israelis, or just living in very unlucky circumstances. You have Christian communities. You have Iraqi Christians, or you used to until they started getting killed and pushed out. You have Lebanese Christians. You have Christians in the West Bank and Gaza, presumably. Where are the Christian suicide bombers? Where are the Christians cutting the heads off of Yazidis? Where's this death cult behavior among Christians?
Don't count. You have to physically cut somebody's head off.
But here's a science experiment. In this same year, you have people living in the same kinds of conditions, right? I mean, the Christian Palestinians have to go through the same checkpoints as Muslim Palestinians, right, in Israel.
Well, I have an answer to that.
Okay, what is the answer?
Okay, so it's not specifically in Palestine, but in Northern Ireland, what did they do when they felt they were oppressed and they were occupied? They bombed civilians, right? What did the Tamils do in Sri Lanka? They bombed civilians.
If you've changed,
when they felt that they were oppressed and occupied, they always bombed civilians.
No, I can talk. No, but they don't always, because we are not seeing the Christian suicide bombers. Right, so we can talk about Ireland.
Okay, but hold on. If you're being incredibly specific on suicide bombers, okay, we had Buddhist suicide bombers, kamikaze fighters. Okay, so we've had them all.
Okay, let's not be so scattershot here. So I can talk. I've written and spoken about the link between Zen Buddhism and the kamikaze pilots. Right, so you can get a death cult out of some quasi-Buddhist ideas. Now, Zen Buddhism is different from Theravada Buddhism and Vajrayana Buddhism, and it's not actually a stretch to see how it doesn't emphasize compassion in the same way that, for instance, Tibetan Buddhism does. So when you see Tibetan Buddhists mistreated by the Chinese, they're not practicing suicide bombing. They're practicing self-immolation. They're burning themselves, right? They're not blowing themselves up on buses, and it makes a lot of sense given their religious dogmas, right? The connection between the Buddhism and the kamikaze pilots is drawn from Zen, but it was also Japanese nationalism and Shinto, and it was kind of a weird brew of a militaristic doctrine there. But it is easy to see how Zen was helpful there, right? I'm not denying that. But again, we have to be honest about the degrees of remove from a very clear doctrine and behavior.
So, Sam, this goes to the heart of the issue. This goes to the heart of it. Go ahead.
So it's easy to see how we could make the Quran worse, right? So we can make it better and we can make it worse, right? It is exactly the way it is, and certain lines are open to interpretation, but it would be worse, for instance, if it didn't have that line that there's no compulsion in religion, right? When you take that line out, you've just taken out one tool that moderate people have to resist all the other barbarism there. And it's easy to see how it could be worse. It could be on the bottom of every page, it could say, oh, and by the way, don't forget, you have to kill those homosexuals, right? On every page, it could reiterate that. That would be a more emphatic exposition of a doctrine that's already in there, but to emphasize it to that degree, we would expect more homophobia and more murders of homosexuals in the Muslim world as a result. And if there was a single page in there that said, listen, guys, homosexuality is a totally natural byproduct of evolution. It is love between a man and a woman is just as legitimate. There's no problem here. You should just honor it. If that doctrine were in there, it would be, you wouldn't find a hatred of homosexuals.
So we've been over this. What you're saying is that the doctrine matters.
It really matters.
But Sam, I don't disagree with that.
Okay, but you had Reza Aslan on here for an hour saying the doctrine doesn't matter because it's all about...
No, I don't agree with Reza. And I said throughout that I don't agree with Reza. Reza talks about how the truth is something that was a concept that came up a couple 100 years ago. I mean, that's a nice linguistic turn,
tell that
right?
to Plato.
Right?
Yeah.
So I don't agree with that. That's why I'm agnostic. That's why I don't believe in any of the religions, right? Because, no, there is a truth. 2 + 2 does equal 4.
But you're still resisting
right?
you're resisting specific consequences of specific beliefs.
No, I'm not. I know that Islam, by having the things that are the damaging parts in there, lead to sometimes bad results. I believe that it is part of the mix as to why people do the suicide bombings and all the bad things, right?
So then why are you disagreeing? It drives me nuts.
I believe that there is plenty of that in the Bible that has led to all that as well. In fact, when you talk about homosexuals, again, who's killed more homosexuals in history? By far the Christians. By
Christians
far.
are equally culpable on that front,
right.
Yes.
Okay.
He is biased to one due to his background.
So, well, not equally, worse. Okay.
Well, wanting to kill homosexuals is bad in both contexts. I mean,
that's exactly
it's dangerous
my point,
it's probably more dangerous to be homosexual in the Muslim world at the moment.
Sam, that's exactly my point. My point is that Christians have done worse to homosexuals, but it doesn't really matter because both don't like homosexuals. It says it in the text. It says it in the doctrine, right? So there's no need to say Islam is worse or Christianity is worse. So that's what I'm saying when we talk about the heart of the issue.
Why
Sam,
ignore the differences?
hold on.
Why ignore the differences between the faiths?
Okay, hold on. Now, when you say, the doctrine of Islam is worse, which we still have a disagreement on that.
Let me just remind you what I said about stem cell research. The doctrine of Islam is totally off the hook on that. So now why don't you object to me saying that? But why not object to my saying that? It's an accurate thing to say, but you seem to be going down the path of, oh no, they must be equally bad.
We're coming back to the disagreement on whether 2 + 2 = 5 or 6 is worse, when there is plenty enough bad material in all the religions that if you wanted to go in that direction, you would have plenty of excuse to do so. And Christianity has done that in great abundance, not only in the past, but they still do it today. Okay. So the question to me is not whether your text sucks, because I think it does. I think it does in Christianity, in Judaism, and in Islam, and in many of the other religions, but not all and not to the same degree. But they suck enough that it gives you excuse to do violence, right? Okay. So now given that, when you have the Tamil Tigers do the terrorism when they're occupied and oppressed, and you have the Catholics doing it in Northern Ireland, and you have the Muslims doing it in Palestine, is it not fair to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe it's not just the religion, that religion, yes, unfortunately contributes to that and is a damaging part of the mix, but obviously there's also geopolitical factors involved here, which leads them all to the same result.
Okay, well, let me deal with 2 points here. One is, there's still the differences, the specific and often tiny differences between the faiths really matter in terms of, even though they both suck equally in terms of the barbarism that's in there, that seems to be, these texts can't be edited. So the barbarism of Leviticus and Deuteronomy is there for all time, if you're a Christian or a Jew, and likewise with the Quran for Muslims. But because of tiny differences in theology, the different groups have different tools available to them to ignore the barbarous passages for all time. So for instance, the line you cited from Matthew, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, unto God that which is God's, that is a huge and long lever that you can pull to just separate politics and religion. It's just render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, okay? It's just religion's over here, politics is over there. And that it does immense work for some certain number of Christians. There is not the same logic of separating man's law from God's law in the Quran and the Hadith and the example of Muhammad. There just isn't. This is a huge problem.
So I agree and disagree on that as well. So the part I agree with,
and you can see the difference within the contrasting societies.
you on is I've always thought that one of the huge problems with Islam is this marriage of mosque and state, if you will, right? So that's that it's definitely in the books, and it's definitely something that is practiced far too often. Not all the time, and not in different cultures. And I think culture makes an enormous difference. And so that's a whole part of another part of the conversation we can get into. But at the same time, Sam, if you were right that it was so central that you couldn't do without it, well then, we've talked about how other religions have done equally terrible things, if not worse things. But let's talk about whether Muslims can do great things, good things, and things where they cherry pick the good parts and not the bad parts, right? So, for example, the Ottoman Empire, one of the largest Muslim empires in world history, of course, right? So did they kill all the infidels? No, they didn't, right? Did they kill a lot while they were conquering? Sure, as any conquering empire does, the Roman Empire, the British Empire, etc., right? But they were incredibly open to the different religions, and they in fact would give autonomy to the different parts of the Ottoman Empire as long as you paid your taxes. Okay, you got to pay your taxes, otherwise they'll come and kill you, right? But if you paid it, they don't care, and they give you autonomy to do whatever you want. So, and the original Arab Empire that was the rise of Islam was more liberal, was more scientific, more advanced than the Christians were at the time. So it is possible, and we have seen throughout history, when Muslims are more liberal, more scientific, more advanced. So what part of that is irredeemable? What part of that it makes it impossible to cherry pick the good parts? Okay,
well, you can cherry pick the good parts, and you can ignore the bad parts, and you can just not pay much attention to the doctrine, as many millions of Muslims clearly do, and that's a great thing. And I think the future of humanity depends on us religious people unwinding their attachment to this notion of revelation in the first place. So the idea that these books were inerrant and dictated by the creator of the universe, we have to become less and less convinced of that proposition and ignore these doctrines more and more, and that's the path forward for everybody. We need a secular world. So Muslims clearly can do that to some degree, right? This history you allude to, this is increasingly we're getting a politically correct and romanticized history of the ages of Muslim tolerance and how good life was for Jews and Christians under Islam when the Christians were barbarians in the Middle Ages and launching aggressive wars of conquest against the Crusades against the Muslim world. What you had were Christian barbarians attacking a highly cultivated and otherwise peaceful Muslim world. Okay, this is largely a fantasy. It's largely cooked up in the novels of Sir Walter Scott and Benjamin Disraeli. I mean, the idea of Andalusia and things being great for Jews.
No. So that's also 50-50. If people talk about a utopia, that's crazy. They conquered people.
That here, but I'm just saying that people should be suspicious of how good life was.
The Ottomans did rescue hundreds of thousands of Jews from the Inquisition. Okay, now it was largely for probably business reasons and the empire and the maintenance, but they said, we'll take the Jews off your hands. That's a fact, right?
Yes, but the problems continued, and Maimonides, it's often said that Maimonides recognized how great life was in the Muslim world, but this is not true. He was in continuous flight from persecution, and he referred to Muhammad, I think, as the madman. So he was not a fan of Islam. In any case, the comparison with the height of Christian insanity in the Middle Ages is obviously, it's of course, life was terrible for Jews in medieval Christianity. So you have a civilization that is completely deranged by its religiosity, where people are being burned alive for heresy and witchcraft, and you're talking about ages of the starkest ignorance, where people, the bubonic plague is ravaging Europe, and all the Christians can think to do is start cutting the tongues out of blasphemers, because they have no idea of how people get sick, and they just think blasphemy must be the cause, right? So you're dealing with a completely deranged religious world. And yes, then by comparison with Christianity at that point, Islam looks rather good. But again,
Okay, it is 8 o'clock and I have to get going. I'm going to save the rest of the debate for a future stream. I have a lot to do right now, trying to get other things set up regarding this channel and on other platforms. So definitely going to use it for future content, and we will move forward when the time comes. So thank you for watching. We'll see you later.